How to improve self-awareness when making business decisions. Becoming self-aware has to do with shifting your frame of reference so you aren't focusing on the past. You actually find out why. Becoming more self-aware will help you make better business decisions. Before, we talked about being a conscious participant, reading the environment, having a kind of sensitivity to signal and noise. When it comes to improving self-awareness, you're expanding the frames of reference and the number of frames that you actually are aware of and able to operate from, so that you're operating from a space of all stakeholders. There's your company, there's you, there's your team, there's your consumers and your clients and your customers, there's the community, there's the industry you're in. There's all levels of things to really pay attention to. And we've talked about you need a certain degree of self-awareness to be at the intersection of all contradiction. Daniel, as we're coming into what it is to become more self-aware and make better business decisions, this level of transjective, transrational awareness and us being able to cultivate that really has us move to this place of conscious participant. And in what I just said about being conscious of our stewardship and our responsibilities, that actually brings real consciousness into business decisions, not just conscience, like I'll do the right thing, but a level of awareness about the impact of my business decisions in how I make those decisions. And some of what we're pointing to in this is when we shift into being a conscious participant and expanding the parameters of our self-awareness, we've actually already shifted our frames of reference. And it gives us the opportunity to see things we hadn't seen before, become more aware of all of the players and stakeholders that are going to be impacted by business decisions I make. Can you say some more about what it is to expand your self-awareness and the impact that has as you expand the parameters of your self-awareness?
Well, as you expand the parameters of your self-awareness, it starts perhaps by being aware of in each of those contexts. And without getting too deep into or too off the side of that conversation, you just say that there's a self that shows up in business often that can be different than the self that's with our family, that can be different with the self in our community, that can be different from the self in the various contexts of our life. And so to be more self-aware in a, let's say, trans-contextual way might say, I'm aware that who's the self that shows up in each of these contexts, and maybe to have a self-inquiry that allows you to be present to why you have that particular version of yourself that shows up in those areas. So to increase your self-awareness would mean you'd be present to the larger context that create the different self-images, the different self-contexts that we embody and show up as, so that then the frame of reference has to do with the context within who that is that's showing up, and what would it mean to expand your sense of self-awareness to a place that's trans-contextual, so that you can integrate all of those different versions of yourself in a way that perhaps makes the decisions you make in business wiser, more trans-contextual, and less affected by the past frames, perhaps, so that the frame of reference from which you're filtering who is the self that's showing up to these different contexts can have a wider parameter that's more integrated with what's moving through and what wants to happen, so that your decisions are made for perhaps more trans-contextual, wiser, more full of wisdom, less affected by your past version of self, and that you can be aware of the call to a larger sense of self with wider frames of reference.
That's great, Daniel. What I'm hearing you're beginning to edge into is this notion of the future creates the past. That is an unaccounted for frame for many, because we're so trained and so almost brainwashed into the past creates the future. And so my past knowledge is so important in terms of creating the future. Yet the past knowledge that we have is irrelevant to the kind of changes that are happening and the kind of wicked problems that we're dealing with now. So could you say a little more about this notion from photon research that the future creates the past?
Yeah, in the photon research, when they investigated what's called the seed moment, which came from the aviation industry, that what's the seed moment that created a chain of events that caused a plane crash, for instance, or just some event in aviation. In the photon research, different field, that the seed moment was almost always in the future. So if our frame of reference for self is coming from our experience from the past, and then we're not usually present to, that many of the frames we have for our sense of self are compensatory. There was a version of ourself we created to be okay in a certain circumstance. And we're largely unaware of that. So the inquiry of self-awareness would have us be present to the sense of self we created to be okay in a past experience relative to what was happening on the landscape at the time. So if we're present to all of that, that creates a certain sense of possibility. And they say in linguistics, if you don't have a word for something, it doesn't live for you. If you have a frame that says there's an incoming future that isn't based on the past and might be a seed moment creating a rippling effect of a chain of events that would be largely invisible to us if we only have a frame that the past creates the future. Like if we don't have a word for something, it doesn't live for us. If we don't have a frame that says there's an incoming wave from the future that is also creating a chain of events, then our frame from which we create our self-awareness and self-identity is going to be limited. And so expanding our frame of reference from which we investigate our sense of self is inherently expanded by allowing for causative nature of a wavefront from the future.
Yeah, so to underscore what you just said, the future creates the past that opens up, expands the breadth and depth of the frames that are incoming from the future. Means you'll be changing your identity, the frames that have made up who you are. And sometimes that becomes a challenging thing for leaders who are known a particular way. And then they need to change their identity, and that begins to expand their self-awareness. And vice versa, as you expand your self-awareness, it actually leads to a change in your identity. Can you say some more about that as it relates to how do we change the world and how do we start to shift into this awareness of when we're making business decisions? Because that's how we start to change the world, is choice by choice from a whole different place. How does this impact our identity?
There's a phrase called letting go to let come. And we say that there's sometimes we say, well, that's a 60-year-old, 16-year-old, meaning chronologically the person is 60 and psychologically they might still be a teenager, which can be good if it keeps you open to life. But if the pattern is set, that can be problematic. So I'd say that we acknowledge that in growing, we are theoretically called to change, which means if we're growing from a child to a teenager to 20-something to an adult to quote unquote an elder, that we would hope that at each of those stages of life there's a growth, which means the change of identity and a letting go of who we were. So then in terms of self-inquiry and self-awareness, if we're expanding our frames of reference and we're including the future that wants to happen and what's moving through, and we're saying that there are decisions we will make in business as a leader that is not just reflecting our growth as a leader and as a person, the growth of our company and its place in the world, hopefully a positive impact. That means that we will be expanding the frames of reference for how we identify self, how we identified self as leader, how we identified the self brand, is how we often refer to that as the company, the brand identity. So personal identity, company identity, product identity. If we're saying that that's a growing, evolving response to the future that wants to happen and what's moving on the landscape that we're present to because of our self-inquiry, freedom to let go of a previous identity creates the space to be present to that.
So a deeper, wider parameter of your sense of self and your self-awareness creates a different world, and you're making business decisions from that new sense of awareness in that different world that's already been opened by virtue of you working with your own expansion of parameter for sense of self. If you'd like to know how to use this shift in awareness to have meaning in your life beyond your role as leader, come watch our next video.